Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Collegium Institute, which serves the University of Pennsylvania, and Dappled Things, a quarterly of ideas, art, and faith. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful co-sponsors for this event who helped us spread the word and got all of you here. Lumen Christi, Nova Forum, Ecstasis Magazine, Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, Durham University's Center for Catholic Studies, the Newman Center for the Study of Religions at University of College Dublin, and Wellspring, a Mother Artist project. As I said, my name is Jess Sweeney, and I'm the Managing Director of Collegium Institute's Ars Vivendi Arts Initiative, which aims to create a conversational space to explore the relationship between beauty, faith, and the arts, probing their importance to human culture and to a life well lived. The initiative seeks to integrate artistic craft and practice with an understanding of aesthetics and an appreciation for the intellectual life behind the creative mind. In his poem, How to Be a Poet by Wendell Berry, a line of which inspired today's event title, Berry leads us through the creative process, the silence and the sounds, the mundane and the transcendent, what to pursue and what to avoid, how to make a place from which to make, transform, and bring to life. Make a place to sit down, he writes. Sit down, be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill. More of each than you have. Inspiration, work, growing older, patience. For patience joins time to eternity. In the stanza that follows, he writes, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And perhaps this is true not just of physical places, but of painted spaces, written spaces, sculpted spaces. What if any work of art, even non-explicitly religious works of art, has the potential for the sacred in it? There are paintings that on first glance, for example, look ordinary, mundane. Take the painting that's on the poster for today's event. There is a young man reading at a table, looking out a window in a domestic space. But through subtle details, in this case, a book, a vase of flowers, a look of epiphany, light streaming in, this everyday scene is transfigured. It has become a holy moment, a kind of annunciation. And perhaps then the creative process, if we agree with Berry and his poem, is similar. If we desire it, within the process of making, one can move between the mundane and the transcendent. Berry writes, accept what comes from the silence. Make the best you can of it, of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers, prayed back to the one who prays. Make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came. And so today, in order to explore this in-between place, enmeshed in the world of time, of labor, of frustration, of distraction, of action, as well as the possibility for encountering moments of eternity, spaces of reception, inspiration, wonder, wholeness, and perhaps even the touch of the divine, I am joined by four makers, a writer, a sculptor, a poet, and a painter. Amy Olsenauer is a writer of essays, children's books, and a memoir. Amy also teaches mathematics at Northwestern University. She is the editor of the facsimile edition of Mistaken Identity by Flannery O'Connor, as well as an award-winning picture book, The Strange Birds of Flannery O'Connor. David J. Mitchell is a figurative Scottish sculptor based in Glasgow. Working in many different materials, often creating pieces in classical and traditional forms, David produces pieces in marble, bronze, terracotta, and plaster in order to achieve his artistic vision. Chiyuma Elliott is a poet and professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her scholarly work and teaching focus on poetry and poetics and African American intellectual history from the 1920s to the present. She has published 4 books of poetry, most recently in 2021, blue and green. And lastly, Lee Noel Wilson is a figurative artist living and working in Baltimore, Maryland. Her work documents the mundane, humorous, overloaded, holy, tender, relevant aspects of daily domestic life. She is founder and editor of Milked, an arts publication which brings art that explores the maternal experience to the forefront of contemporary culture. I'll now be handing things off to our 4 panelists who will each give some short opening remarks of about 10 minutes each, beginning with Amy. When all 4 of our panelists have finished, we will then come together for questions and conversation that I'll be moderating. And we will then end by opening it up to questions from all of you in attendance today. Please feel free to start sending in your questions at any time throughout the event. You'll be able to use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And while we won't be able to get to all of your questions, we hope that we can get to as many as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Amy.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jess, for this. I am just in love with the way you framed this panel, and I am so honored to be here with these other artists. When we met ahead of time, had a beautiful conversation, so I've really been looking forward to this. All right, so as Jess said, we only have 10 minutes. I am going to dive right in so I don't go beyond mine. So I think the reason why I'm going first is because what I'd like to talk about is what comes before our ability to create, before the artistic process. So one of the central governing myths of my own artistic life is that I've wanted all of my life to be a writer, but for decades, I did not write. So all the way through my childhood, young adult years, I did not write. And of course, this made me feel, as I was growing up and in my early adult years, it made me feel like I couldn't call myself a writer and maybe wouldn't ever be able to call myself a writer, because so many around me, so many other artists I saw out there in the world were working with the opposite myth, which is that they were always creating. From the very beginning, they were always writing, they were always drawing. But eventually I was able to connect with my material and began to write in a way that I was happy with. And I found out that those exact same years of apparent inactivity became the rich ground from which I created. So I had to reformulate how I looked at those years as not a wasteland, but as something deep and rich and even essential to the artistic life. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to call what I'm talking about the via negativa of the artistic life. And the reason why I'm using that theological term is because I think it acknowledges that the thing we are after, God in the case of theology, that the thing we're after dwells in darkness. And it's a darkness in which all names disappear, right? It's something that transcends any concept or language that we may attempt to apply to it. So I'm again trying to get at that prior thing, that thing that exists prior to our articulation, our ability to articulate or to make art. So just to back up a minute. So growing up, again, in diary after diary, this is a picture of one of my actual diaries from growing up. I would write every week, every day, even about how I wanted to be a writer. So my writing was a record of this desire without actually ever turning into what I was hoping to produce. I remember one torturous summer in particular where I took this book dutifully to the library every day and forced myself through these writing prompts that were supposed to help you develop dialogue and scenes and all of those elements of craft. But because I hadn't accessed my material yet, they came out dead. And of course, because I was a reader, I knew what I was after, but I wasn't producing that. So that again accentuated this belief that I might never be able to call myself a writer. Okay, so I'm always looking for ways to articulate this prior thing. And I recently, this is very recent, have been reading a book by Alfred North Whitehead, who's a mathematician, who wrote a beautiful little book called The Rhythm of Education. And he says this, he articulates 3 different stages of education, the first of which is the romance stage. And he says this about that stage. He says that education must essentially be a setting in order of a ferment already stirring in the mind. You cannot educate mind in vacuo. So I love this idea that the activity of the mind happens on a stage. So we come to this stage that is already set. It is already set with this ferment, this stirring ferment, this immensity, this real presence that exists prior to any attempt our minds make to articulate, to bring language, to bring picture forming, concept forming ideas to bear upon it. So what allowed me, there was actually a moment in my life that allowed me to look back at those early years of inactivity and reformulate them. And it was something I came across by the children's book author, Catherine Patterson, a 2-time Newbery Award-winning author, who was one of my favorite authors growing up. And she was asked that perennial question of her origin stories, how did you become a writer? And she said, I didn't write as a child. I wasn't a storyteller as a child, but this is what she said. She said, I loved stories so much, I wanted to be on the inside. And that's actually the way I've remembered it. I've never been actually able to find those exact words, but that was the sentiment. And I realized that what was happening in those years was desire. And desire is letting you know that something is there, right? It is that restless heart. It is that thing that allows you, it is that call, it is that vocational call that allows you access to that ferment. Okay, so what actually then comes out of the ferment? So you need to contact that before any of that advice will ever matter to you. You have to realize that this material is inside of yourself, okay? And then once you have, then that artistic process can begin. So I wanted to share with you a little clip. This is very short from the artist that illustrated The Strange Birds of Flannery O'Connor, Ping Zhu. So there's 2 little bits, less than a minute and a half total, where I think she really gets at this process. Okay, so this first little clip, let me just tell you quick. When she was working on the illustrations for this book, she was also finishing an illustration for the cover of a Criterion Film DVD. And Criterion Film came and did what they call a studio visit. So they came to her studio and captured some of her thinking during this time. So here is the first little clip. So this is from Ping Zhu.
I wouldn't say that I was especially great at drawing or, creativity. I think it took many forms just as a child, you're just like imagining things. I like to play alone and like kind of make imaginary worlds.
Okay, so we're going to stop with that. She said she's basically articulating the same myth of my artistic life, which is, and I'm calling it a myth, not because I don't think it's true, but because it's sort of like a governing story, right, of my artistic life. So she said I wasn't particularly good, she says, at creativity. But then she says, I played alone. I love to play alone and make imaginary worlds. So now we're going to fast forward. And she says, I'm doing all this work for hire. I'm doing all these illustration projects, but suddenly I've been given this assignment to illustrate a children's book. It's her debut children's book. And I have years to do it. So now listen to her talk about how she gets into imagining for this.
This isn't going to be like the book, but I think the process of finding like what the book will look like requires a little bit of experimenting and a little bit of unknown. I feel like the cut paper feels like a sketch where it's like, well, I just want to use these colors. I just want to see what this shape makes with something else. And it's instilling a bit of play in the process. The work that I usually do, it's maybe like anything from a day to like maybe a few weeks to like a month at the most, but it's very rare to get any kind of project that would give you years to work on. being able to invent a world is something that I've never really done before. So it's a little bit daunting, but I think, I'm just going to have to throw myself into it and see what happens.
So as we let this play out, what I love there is, and I don't think she's even conscious of it. I think maybe the person who put this beautiful little film together was conscious of it. And I certainly am as the viewer. She says, I've never done this before. I've never invented a world. And yet there she was as a child inventing imaginary worlds. So we see that what she's actually doing here to get into this work that she calls her own work, right, is trying to access that ferment. And you see the way she's getting into it is actually through this form of art, this cutting and pasting that she calls a sketch, that is very childlike in its nature, to bring up those deep feelings from the ferment, right, into art. And I think for very many artists, very many writers, that emotional source resides in childhood. So I want to end with a quotation. We're talking about Flannery O'Connor from O'Connor herself, and her ferment very much was her childhood as well, which is something I think about and write about a lot. So here's the final statement. She says, the artist will have to descend far enough into herself to reach those underground springs, that's her word for the ferment, that give life to her work. The descent into herself will be a descent through the darkness of the familiar, into a world where, like the blind man cured in the Gospels, she sees men as if they were trees, but walking. This is the beginning of vision. So what we're after in order to begin creating is vision. So not only by accessing the ferment do we allow ourselves, do we give ourselves that ability to create, but we also shield ourselves against the kind of killing sense of competition that often arises in artistic communities, because we realize that that vision resides in the depth of our own personhood and cannot be repeated by any other person on earth. So I want to stop with that. Hopefully I'll be able to draw on this a little bit in the Q&A, but I would like to now turn it over to David, the Scottish sculptor, who is going to speak next. So let me just stop sharing so I can turn it over to him.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Jess, for the invitation to speak. It was an interesting topic you put forward, and it was something I'd actually been doing a lot of thinking on beforehand. So maybe it's been ordained. Right. So let me just start. So, Beauty and the Beast, the Nutcracker, Frankenstein, Pinocchio, Toy Story, what do these all have in common? They're all stories where inanimate objects are brought to life in one way or another. Is this a quaint storytelling trope, or does it point to a deeper relationship between the creator and the created? Dolls and action figures are representations of reality. The life the child invests in a figure is part imposed on the child's reality, part constructed from pure fantasy, and part held by the object itself. The child imagines life in that figure. Children given something boring like a brick are much less likely to form the same kind of emotional bond with that object as they do with, say, a teddy bear or a Barbie doll. As adults, do we consider ourselves to have outgrown this? The work of the artist is that of transformation. An observation or feeling becomes an idea. The idea is developed and becomes a concept. The concept is realized in physical form. The sculptor works that form through clay, plaster, wax, and bronze. The shape of that object is physical, but that which it conveys is beyond physical, as it communicates directly with the mind, the emotions, the inner being of the viewer. It becomes more than a cold, dead, emotionless entity. We could say it has changed from one state of being into another. It carries meaning and message above and beyond the physical. It has transcended the limitations of the physical form, and it has entered the realm of the metaphysical. This should not surprise us. In the story, of Pygmalion, a sculptor has lost his faith in humanity and in women in particular. He is disgusted by a group of prostitutes. He takes dislike to all women. He goes into his studio and carves a marvelous ivory sculpture of his ideal woman. The statue is so beautiful that Pygmalion falls in love with it. He prays that he will be given a wife as perfect as his own creation. The goddess Aphrodite hears his prayer, feeling Pygmalion's deep anguish, and goes beyond his request, bringing the statue to life. The statue becomes a real living woman made from flesh and blood. She and Pygmalion are married and have children. Myths like Pygmalion illustrate for us the human instinct to transfer a portion of ourselves onto inanimate objects as an extension of our own creative life. This primal instinct shines a light for us on the reason why we create objects in the likeness of life. Okay, if everyone closes their eyes for a second and thinks of their favourite piece of art, what comes to mind? Is it maybe beauty, love, pride, or awe? Okay, you can open your eyes. All of these feelings are conjured up from the object itself. These feelings that you just felt a moment ago when your eyes were closed wouldn't have come into being if it wasn't for that object. And so that object is the possessor of these emotions. We could say that the object is in a real sense alive, or maybe even has a soul, possibly. It is, however, important to note that the magnitude of separation between the man-made and man is similar to the degree of separation between man and God. We are the inanimate objects to God, to man as God. Isaiah says this, Isaiah 44. The carpenter measures a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with a chisel and marks it with a compass. He shapes it in human form in all of its glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cuts down cedars, or perhaps an oak or cypress. He lets it grow up among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It is used for fuel, for burning. Some of it he takes to warm himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread, but he fashions it a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares a meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm, I see the fire." From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to worship it. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." The ancient Babylonians at the time of Isaiah believed that their idols were inhabited by their gods. Once the mouth was opened, the spirits would go in through the mouth. In Exodus, we see that the creation of images is prohibited. However, on closer reading, the key component is "you shall not bow down," as Isaiah said previously. We read, in fact, that there is a specific instruction to Moses to create images in the likeness of living beings, to adorn the Ark of the Covenant, the temple curtains, the priest's clothes, among some other things. There's also an interesting old Jewish tradition of lesser known, kind of maybe slightly occultic tradition, in which there is not just the belief that life can be given to inanimate objects, but that by following a prescribed set of instructions, life will be given to that which is dead. A golem is a creature made out of clay into which life has been injected by magical means. The Hebrew word golem means something incomplete or unfinished. Talmudic tradition says that Adam is called golem, that is a body without a soul, for the first 12 hours of his existence. According to one story, to make a golem, a clay sculpture, come alive, one would shape it out of clay and then walk or dance around it saying a combination of letters from the alphabet and the secret name of God. This attribute is not unique to the arts. A book can be reduced to basic components: words, paper, ink, and yet still carry with it the suggestion of a higher entity has played a part in its creation. The hand of the writer is seen on every page. So too is it with sculpture. A bronze bust is not simply a metal is not simply metal, but a vast container filled with meaningful sentiment crafted by the artist. Michelangelo said, "I saw an angel in the marble and I carved until I set him free." The sculptor Rodin says, quote, "The resemblance which the artist ought to obtain is that of the soul. That alone matters. It is that which the sculptor should seek beneath the mask of features. In a word, all the features must be expressive, that is to say, of use in the revelation of conscience." End quote. It is the job of the artist to seek beneath the mask of features. This, of course, is not limited to portraiture, but to all subject matter. The artist must seek that which is covered by the veil of the same world. As we view a work of art, we may begin to animate it in our mind. We make connections with the subject via the eye of the artist, through the artist and subject, even though the artist and the subject may be long dead. In the case of figurative portraiture, this effect is felt immediately. It is an individual caught in a moment in time. The work holds within itself the ability to connect the heavens and earth, the living and the dead. It stands on its own, independent of its creator, yet possessing the ability to speak for itself, conveying the essence of the individual. The work on some level has its own being, bestowed on it by the artist. In a sense, it has its own life, since it exists existentially from the creator, much in the same way we all possess particular attributes from our creator God, but yet exists as a separate contingent being. Does Michelangelo's Pietà require explanation? Does Van Gogh's Starry Night require Vincent's commentary on the piece, the painting, the canvas to enhance it? When we think beyond the surface level viewing of the objects around us, we give any creation by human hands a much more fulfilling existence. Our day-to-day studio practice in whatever discipline you undertake is an expression of man as creator and God as chief architect. Our created objects, be it painting, sculpture, music, words, etc., are like children. They are raised up in our image, shaped by us, and sent off into the world to exist on their own. And when we think of our work like this, it changes how we see the world, it changes how we approach our work, and it honours our God as the creator. Thank you. And I'm just going to pass over to Chiyuma Elliott as well.
Hey, folks. Oh my gosh, it's so great to get to go third, because there's something so beautiful about listening to everybody else. I mean, I know that we've already had sort of pre-conversations about this. It's so gorgeous to hear your thoughts. So let me start by saying this. Jess, I was listening to your introduction and your comment about your quote from Wendell Berry's poem about there are no unsacred places. And I have to say that at the beginning, I actually think Berry's speaker is wrong. And that's part of the joy of art for me, right? Is figuring out how do you make the sacred, like the lack of the sacred or the unsacred place actually is a challenge for figuring out, like as a poet, as an artist, like how to make certain places, certain moments in poems sacred. So I just want to say that as a provocation at the outset. So here goes the prepared part of my remarks. Even before I was invited to be on this panel, I've been thinking a lot about the rituals associated with writing, because so many of mine have been upended by the pandemic. Also because I'm a teacher, and many of my students have needed help reconnecting with writing or with their confidence in their writing, which these past couple of years have really shaken. In order to say anything useful about this, I have to start with two of my poetry heroes, Louise Glick and Terence Hayes. I'm always really interested in their poetry because it's extraordinary. But during this pandemic, I keep coming back to their candor about the ongoing difficulties of writing and their deep self-knowledge and their generosity in sharing about these things with fellow makers. At a creative writing residency once, I saw a bunch of fellow poets spontaneously asking our teacher, Terence Hayes, for writing prompts outside of workshop. We'd just be walking to the dining hall or back from a reading or something like that, and someone would just call out, "Hey, Terence, got a new prompt for us?" And Terence was like, "Yeah, man," and just handed people pages with these insane, amazing poem prompts on them, and often embellished with his incredible, intricate artwork. He later explained that when he's away from home, he can't write poems. So he writes poem prompts and he makes playlists. So in addition to getting asked for poem prompts at creative writing retreats, he also gets asked to DJ a lot of parties. Okay, here's Know Thyself Poetry Hero story number 2. At a craft talk at Stanford about a decade ago, Louise Glick admitted that she often goes 1 to 2 years without writing any poems. There was this stunned silence in the room after she said that. And then one brave fellow writer asked a clarification question. You mean you don't finish any new poems? And Glick explained that no, when she's between writing her books, there's this very painful stretch where she literally doesn't write any poems. She reads a ton, and she's a teacher, so she helps other people with their poems, but she doesn't write her own work for like 1 to 2 years at all. She explained that the writing silence is always hard, but that she's learned to wait it out and fill her life with other meaningful things in the meantime. And then the next book shows up, and then she's deeply immersed in writing again. It mattered profoundly to me to hear this from the two of them. From Terence Hayes and Louise Glick are artists who are literally at the top of their game, at the top of their craft. If they experience writer's block as a regular thing and still make some of the most beautiful and provocative work around, then there's hope for the rest of us. And there's also the implicit wisdom that they shared, that you need to create workarounds for yourself in the times when the poems don't show up. You need to create rituals. Their advice isn't to beat yourself up or to try to change the rhythms of your work in some fundamental way. It's to lean and to learn those personal rhythms really intimately, to lean on them and to accept and anticipate those rhythms, to have faith that there's something worthwhile on the other side of the silence, and to build a life that allows you to make different things and to be generous with others when you're in a poem lull. It's taken me a long time to figure out what my best writing rhythms are, what my rituals are. I don't think I really started to figure this out in any meaningful way until I was in my mid-30s. But once I did, it transformed my writing life. Here's some of the things that I learned, in case these are helpful for any folks who are on the panel, listening to the panel, and thinking about your own creative process. I need a chunk of unstructured time, ideally at least 2 hours with no meetings immediately afterward, because I'll probably be emotionally wiped out. I need no work or just rote work to do afterward, like routine cleaning or errands or something really formulaic, where I don't need to solve any conceptual problems or make important decisions. Fairly recently, I was listening to a BBC podcast to the show In Our Time while eating a late dinner after a long stretch of grading papers. This particular podcast episode was about prehistoric plants and animals, about what we can learn from the deep past. And the details about these armored fish in it were amazing. I was jotting down notes between bites of lasagna, and without meaning to, I started drafting a poem called The Age of Fishes, which meant sitting with it in my PJs, barefoot and a little bit cold at the kitchen table for more than 2 hours until I got the gist of it down on the page, because I knew that I had the time then and I could work out a full rough draft. And what a luxury to have a poem show up, have a poem idea show up when you actually have the time to write it down. Being on the track of a poem for me feels a little bit like bird watching. I have to respond in the moment because otherwise I lose sight of the thing that I just barely perceived or glimpsed, which doesn't mean dropping everything to write a poem. That's just not practical for me most of the time. It means taking a moment to jot down some notes or send myself an email, or when I can't physically write because I'm in transit or something, to call and leave myself a voicemail. I was at an online poetry meeting last month and I learned a new vocabulary word about birds. Check calls. They are the I'm here, where are you? I'm here, where are you? Vocalizations that birds make to check in on one another. That has to go in a poem sometime, but not yet, right? So I jotted the term down along with my personal note-taking symbol that means action item. So I'd see it and come back to it, because forgetting good material, good ideas is the enemy of art. Part of poetry making for me is cross training for it. I used to do yoga, so I had the physical stamina to stay with a piece of writing for longer swaths of time. I will get back to doing yoga after I have knee surgery this summer, and I'm really excited about that. Process-wise, my rituals, right? Often I need to wander around my house for quite a while before I start writing. And when I'm starting something totally new, or I'm stuck and need to work through a next big step, I probably need to sew something like curtains, even if my house doesn't need curtains. I've actually started machine quilting these big multi-layered fabric wall hangings from silk organza, and I buy that by the bolt. it's just a kind of ritual making. And in this case, it's really helpful because, as you can see, this folds up really small. It doesn't take up a whole lot of space. And yeah, that's just when I'm working through a poem, that kinetic making ends up just being really important, like the problem solving. There's something about the kind of manual work and that particular kind of manual work that is part of my ritual. I go out looking for inspiration regularly. Visual art is a huge catalyst for me. It's such a treat to be on a panel with the rest of y'all partly for that reason. I spend a lot of time looking at art online and in person when I can. That's one of the best things about traveling for work sometimes. Sometimes it means I can go visit a local museum or even just see art in different airports. And that's insanely cool. Reading really good poems is a huge catalyst for me. It's probably the biggest catalyst. That said, I have to handle it with care. One of the things we talked about together when we were sort of talking through this panel as a group and the things that were on our minds and what we wanted to say, is that a huge part of the process of making art is learning how to turn the making off. For me, I need to do that so I can be functional in the rest of my life. For example, I ban all poetry reading after 9 p.m. because if I read a really good poem, my brain is going to want to respond to it. It's kind of like bells ringing inside my head and I won't be able to sleep. Good sleep is key. So poetry, the management of reading is part of this for me. So is knowing when you're likely to do good work and when you'll just mess stuff up. When I was a kid growing up, the house rule was no scissors after 9 p.m. because me and my baby sister, Sarah, we were prone to disastrous sewing and crafting choices when we tried to work at night. So no scissors after 9 p.m., no poems after 9 p.m. So that's been a great piece of wisdom that's helped me. I'm an introvert who also loves people. So I've learned that I need time to decompress after any public facing things like readings or events or even teaching classes, which I do all the time. And I still find incredibly exciting and intense. Learning to be gentle about my own limitations is important, and it's an ongoing process for me. I'm learning to accept and roll with what recharges me and where I get my energy. Another thing that's mattered is organizing my life around making art. And that means making sure that my big decisions are aligned around this goal and checking in when circumstances change, like, for example, when a pandemic hits. There's this book called Writing Your Dissertation in 10 Minutes a Day that talks a lot about establishing and sustaining a writing habit. I think of that writing habit, kind of like building a relationship. When you keep promises to yourself, you build trust and confidence, and it feels like building a strong relationship with poetry itself. I've spent years building this relationship, so the small interruptions don't feel so scary, even when they last for 2 years. And part of why they can be less scary is because heroes, right? Poetry heroes like Louise Glick will share their own experiences and struggles and normalize that. This is not to say that I always think poems are going to show up for me. I don't, but I know that I'm always going to show up for them. So even if what happens is that we just sit there in the silence, that's okay. It is an honor, I think, to be in the company of beautiful poems, whether or not I'm the one writing them. So I will close my opening remarks there. Thanks so much for listening to me. Now I get to pass the mic off to Lee.
Hi. All right, just making sure that I have, yes. Great, hello. Again, my name is Lena Wilson, and I'm a representational figurative painter based in Baltimore City. First, also want to again say thank you so much to Jess and the Collegium Institute for setting up, what has already been a really exciting, presentations. These intros have been really wonderful to listen to. So I wanted to start my little intro off with a quick quote from one of my favorite books titled Way of the Aesthetics by Tito Caliander. Between me and my husband, I've been calling it the book that slays me. So this quick quote just so poignantly articulates something that I've been really wrestling with within my artwork for almost a decade. And it reads, At the center of Orthodox theology and spirituality is the theme of theosis, deification, the raising of manhood into God. This is the aim of the liturgy, the Eucharistic celebration, which stands at the center of all worship and all life. But the centrality of the liturgy is set against the background of what Orthodox theologians describe as the world as sacrament. The material world is the vehicle, not the enemy of the spirit. All spirituality has a material basis. As St. John Damascene expressed it, we venerate matter because the creator of matter became material, and through matter affected our salvation. So this idea of the communication of the divine through material things avidly grips me. It also connects with the idea of the commonplace. Commonplace things contributing towards our spiritual sustenance when operating under an exchange system with the Lord. We offer one thing over, he offers it back. But obviously life doesn't seem to happen so linear, despite maybe our deep desire that it would. Usually the exchange happens in more of a fumbling, tumbling kind of wrestle. And as an artist, the canvas and large sheets of paper have always been my wrestling mat, so to speak. It's in an arena where I've been able to go beyond words and enter a field of open prayer and dialogue between myself and God. In other words, it's mostly me complaining to him about different things bothering me while I shove paint from corner to corner, when you're not speaking about it so poetically. And it hasn't been too different within my life as a mother, which will, that'll connect here in a minute. For the past 5 years specifically, I have exclusively worked with charcoal and graphite on large scale sheets of Lenox paper in order to study material and focus on the paradoxical emotions that can be portrayed through the simultaneous scratchy and velvety quality of charcoal. So through abstract expressionism overlapping with figurative realism, I have worked to capture the mundane, the humorous, the overloaded, the holy, the tender aspects of the maternal mind. Lately, I've also been stepping back into painting and not solely working with charcoal. And I've been intrigued to introduce elements of interior space and working to capture a characteristic chronicle of time. And so how does this at all relate to the quote that I read by Tito Caliender? It's because my time is so often spent sitting on the floor or under a table or zooming around tiny cars or building with tiny Legos and just doing almost nothing with my children as I stare and stare and stare at, our patterned rugs and watching the light slowly shifting across the wall. And hearing things over and over 10 times a day. Mommy, can you take a picture of my drawing? Or like, look at this or look at that. And just so wrapped up in their little world. I lose my good posture due to buckling over and helping undress and dress and redress and hugging busted knees and wrangling, tantrum throwing toddlers. And so many times I wonder how these moments can be so incredibly boring at the same time as just being crucially edifying. And so the one thing that I think, the only thing really that I can think to do in order to wrestle with this is actually to zoom in on those moments, on those banal domestic scenes, the humdrum of family routine within my painting, and to take those very moments into the studio with me. And so then within highlighting something so plain, I'm attempting to open a window into the process of sanctity and portray my commonplace. And it's just been the utmost irony, really, that the monotony of motherhood has actually been the most dramatic tactic of the Lord to raise my soul. And then in my attempt to partake in that exchange with him, I paint and I wrestle and I try to grip him in a sense. And so there's 1,000 different stories within the Bible, most often the story of Jacob and the angel that go around and around and around as I am both in these very mundane moments and in the studio. And so it's been becoming the work of my life to try and cross those things over. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll actually all stay up on the camera now, and we'll sort of enter a time of conversation together. Thank you to all of you for those amazing opening remarks. I'm really excited to get to sort of jump into conversation and talk with all of you. And also, as I told you guys, feel free to ask questions of each other as well. But I think I wanted to start maybe with this question that sort of, I think all of you in some ways touched on it in various different ways. But Lee, you touched on it here at the end, but also in all of them, the sense of these moments, either pauses or darkness or moments of rest, or at least moments of not necessarily working, and how those sort of become a kind of source for your work. And I think as I was listening to all of you, it seemed like to be that there was even some kind of relationship there to thinking of the spiritual life and sort of moments of consolation, moments of desolation, and kind of working with those, working in the darkness. And there's a lot, obviously in scripture, a lot to be said about those moments of darkness and where those lead. So I guess I'm wondering if any of you have more thoughts to add to that as you think about your own work and process.
I'd love to jump in on this, partly because there's a question in the Q&A that just really from Mira that relates to this, I think, in this really beautiful way. And Mira, I'm so glad that you asked this. So Mira wrote, I felt afraid as an artist in times of personal spiritual growth, healing and maturing, that my voice or depth will be lost when I'm not suffering something. Do any of you relate? And what would you say about changing as a person and allowing your work to have space to change too? I think this thing about the pauses, the darkness, the moments of rest as sources of work relate so much to what you were asking, Mira, right? It's scary when we have to, sometimes when we pause and when we have to sit, with the silence and in that silence. And Lee, I mean, I feel so incredibly energized and inspired hearing about you saying, okay, so here's what I learned about the materials of my life, right? Here's what I learned about this silence that isn't actually so silent, because like you're saying, I'm crawling around on the floor, I'm chasing somebody down, trying to keep somebody from eating a Lego, like doing all these various things. Like it's not actually silent in the conventional sense, but like, how do I make with that and aligned with that? And I just wanted to say for like Mira, what you're saying about what do we do when we're not suffering? I actually think that often the most powerful work that we do doesn't come from the times when we're suffering, right? Like, because I think often when we're the most wounded, it's really hard to be present and to be quiet with the artwork and make in the ways that are really powerful. I think that that actually the joy and the happiness and the connection, all that are really powerful places to write from, which doesn't mean that you're not writing about suffering or complexity or any of those things, but that I think that actually is that's where we do our best work. For me personally, that I learned that recovering sort of emotionally after a second miscarriage, when I was utterly devastated and had to rethink my relationship to God, my relationship to faith, and was writing. I wanted to make something for the child that I'd lost, and nothing that I could make was good enough, right? Or didn't feel like it was. I wanted to make the Taj Mahal, but I don't have that kind of money or architectural talent or real estate or any of that stuff. What I make is poems. I had to heal in order to write the poems in this book, Vigil, right? I had to do that, and it wasn't, I didn't write the poems as a way to set about healing, but I realized that the poems got better. The poems were more successful in wrestling with all these things. when I was able to reconnect with joy. So that's just what I want to say about, silence and suffering and where we are in relationship to that.
I just wanted to add something that is sort of tangential to this, but I was thinking about it as you were talking, Chai. I think that it is so essential to the creative life to share these stories. I was really struck when you said that it was profoundly important to you to hear these stories from established poets of periods of inactivity. And I think what I was talking about is very similar, that you need to hear a story, a narrative that you can see yourself living, that you can see yourself walking, in order to really believe that what's happening to you is part of life that is possible to live. So I just love that. I think it's so important for these honest stories to emerge. The other thing I just wanted to say about this suffering moment that Mira talked about is that I know I have exactly the same feeling as you, that there's certain things from my childhood that I felt like were slipping away from me as I aged. And I was worried that they wouldn't retain their freshness. And in some sense, I think that's true. I once heard this beautiful advice about artistic creation, that we had this tendency to want to hold things in reserve for later projects. And that we can't ever do that, that we need to put everything into every project because we don't know when it will slip away. So I think there's a truth in that. But at the same time, I think that those suffering moments, and I know you were using that not just to refer to suffering, but to all of our moments that matter to us. But I think those moments that matter are recorded, and I'm going to say in the ferment, they're recorded and they will be held there in that sort of not chronos time, not like linear time, but in that kairos gathered time that is always present, and that those moments will come back to us, but maybe not in that same form, in a different form. And we just have to be content to know that they aren't going to run out, and that we can always access some of those forms, and they'll rise up out of that ferment in some sort of illuminated way that will allow us to create maybe in a different way than we would have earlier. So
I can jump in as well. Oopsies.
On you go.
This is like the most polite panel ever.
Yeah, right.
somebody say something.
Okay.
No, we just keep going at the same time.
I will say that. Okay. I will say that there is quite often there's an expectation for the artist to suffer. You think people think of great artists like Van Gogh, who suffered his whole life, and that expectation is put on artists now, that to be a great artist you have to be like that, and you should be rejoicing when things are easy, when you've got period when you've got things are going well. You should be thanking God for that, and you shouldn't torture yourself that things aren't hard for you. I've had periods where things have been difficult, and to be honest, it's those periods where the work doesn't get done, and it's the periods when things are easy, and that's when the best work is done. And imagine if Van Gogh had an easy life. Imagine what kind of work he would have produced. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Sorry for interrupting you. Yeah, I actually really like too that Chai connected this question with Jess's question as well. And I would say that I think that it actually kind of relates to like our natural desire to kind of put things in a hierarchy kind of thing, like essentially, even like a personal thing. I'm going to the studio and I have an idea and I'm kind of like, is this idea good enough to paint? Like there's like this natural kind of hierarchy that my mind is already kind of qualifying something under. And I think as well, there's like I somewhat, hopefully this makes sense. I somewhat, within Mara's question, I somewhat see that there too, like when you're not suffering, as if there's a time that you're not suffering, when kind of in reality, we're like, if we switch our mindset from the word of suffering over to the word of wrestling, or just kind of chewing on something, you know, then that means that that type of suffering is kind of always there, you know, because this I think that we're also kind of somewhat almost kind of raised to think in like rather than to think cyclically, we kind of think in a beginning and an ending kind of linear way. Something starts, something finishes. So you have an occurrence that has happened, it has started, and then it comes to an end, and now you're in a more joyful state, you know, or place, and we're on the grass is greener on the other side of that, you know, like we finally got to, oh sweet, we got out of the valley up to the mountaintop, we're down in the valley again. Like it's kind of still this linear way of thinking. But I think that ultimately, if you challenge yourself to think about impatience as something that you are suffering with, that actually is something to chew on and to wrestle with within your artwork. And so that for me has always kind of been, or recently, this, you know, I very much so also used to kind of worry, like, oh, I'm getting to points in my life where like, I'm very thankful. I'm so thankful for my family. I'm so thankful for the position I'm in now. I feel mature in my artistic voice. So I can very much relate to Mara's sentiments. But then once you kind of realize like, well, why am I going to confession every month then? Like, you know, I've obviously have something to confess. I have things to bring before the Lord. And so if my artwork is also essentially going to be either just a simple autobiographical documentation of that, or it's going to be a place where I really work out this stuff, then ultimately you always have material to pull from. You know, there's many times that I am laying on the floor again, very, very, very impatient, getting angry because I'm resentful of being on this floor for the, you know, 5th year in a row. You know, and so it's like, if you know, why would I not bring that to my artwork if that is the place that I have chosen to also pray within and stuff. So hopefully that all kind of makes sense. But I think sometimes we need to challenge our thinking to wonder, like, what is it that we're actually struggling with? Oftentimes it's not that you have lost something so grave, you know, that does happen in life. These grave things really happen in life, but the common day things are more often the things that are kind of in there.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to add a thought and kind of sort of tie this into a question I have. But with Mara's question, right, she sort of ends with this idea of figuring out how to become comfortable with changing as a person and allowing your work to have space to change as well. And I guess so that's something I've sort of recently kind of come to, of this sort of, I had this moment of frustration of like, why can't I keep painting the way I used to 2 years ago when I was pregnant with my daughter, and my first daughter, and in a class. And I realized that I've needed to sort of reorient my mind, right, sort of reframe to think about like, how am I changing as a person and an artist, and it's going to look different. And I don't know enough about Picasso's life to know what caused him to have this sort of medley of stages and phases that he had. But I started thinking about the fact like he had these like blue phases and the rose phase. We obviously called them that. He probably did not call them that. But all of these phases that he moved through in his whole artistic career. And so I started sort of thinking about that. And I think with that, I also am wondering kind of something that David said, this sense of, right, the sort of relationship between the piece of art and the sort of maker, and the mirroring of the relation between us and our creator. And this sense that I think both in making art of any kind, but also in life, there's this sort of wrestle between sort of action and reception, and how we allow ourselves to be changed, but also be actors in that change as well, both as specifically in the process of making. I think that there's like a sort of particular window into thinking about that process of us individually, and then also in relationship to just life and our relationship to God. So I guess I was wondering, I don't know if you have any thoughts specifically about that, David, but this sort of sense of the kind of wrestle between sort of action and reception and sort of, yeah, jumping off of where Lee was as well.
Hey, yeah, I think, you know, we have to realize that, you know, our lives aren't motionless. You know, there's always going to be things going on in the background. And it's, you know, it's being aware of that when you're producing work, but not letting it hold you back, and not forcing it either. You know, there's a tendency to want to force your work to be something you think it should be, and you know, the approach I take is more, you know, just produce the work and let the work be what the work wants to be. And I think when we do the work that way, you know, not forcing it, then I think it's more natural. The work speaks more of what we have in our beings, and I think, yeah, I think it's more reflective of our souls when we're speaking honestly, and not trying to force what we think we should be doing, and just doing instead, if that makes sense.
It does to me. Honesty is scary, right? Like putting the real questions, like you're saying, finding, I don't know, you described when you were giving your opening remarks about finding an artist, finding the sculpture inside the block of marble, right? There's just like this radical honesty there about, and also kind of modesty that I'm hearing, you know, in the way that you're thinking about art as art and art as a spiritual practice, and those things not being separate, that the humility, right? That your job is to find this thing that's there.
Well, I was thinking about your question, Jess, and what I was saying about the ferment, which I was really putting that as something that happens, you know, prior to the artistic life in childhood, but I also mean it as something that is ongoing. And I think, you know, what Chai ended up saying was very kind of took what I was saying and took it into the adult creating realm, because that ferment is something that needs to be tended. And so there necessarily will be these periods of fermentation, right? If you just think about what that word literally means, that are periods of inactivity, right? Of bread rising or something fermenting, right? And that those can be really scary because you don't know what's happening during those times, but that you actually need that. And I thought I wanted to connect this to Jasmine's question, because she's asked me, she said beautifully, she said, you talk of ferment, I viewed it in my life as a quickening or labor pains. She said that egg was always there, then it was fertilized, then it formed into a baby that has to be birthed. How has that been for you? What was the quickening, fermenting like for you in your writing? So I think one of the things that really has to happen as an artist is that you have to come to see what kind of an artist you are. And for me, I think I'm more of a poet, even though I write some poetry, but not a lot. But I think my mode of imagining is very much more of a poetic mode than, say, like a plot-driven mode. So for me, what comes out of that ferment is, so when I first sort of look at memory, I often have this sense that like nothing's ever happened to me, that my life is this sort of murkiness, and there's nothing there. But then as I sort of center in on something, a figure, a moment, then I start seeing these kind of illuminated objects rise out of the ferment. And there's this mathematician, I'm always like making these analogies since math is the other part of my life, this beautiful mathematician, Mariam Mirzakhani, who talked about her own mathematical life. And she said that she saw her work as bringing this odd cast of characters together and getting them to talk to each other. So for me, what rises out of that ferment is that sense of these illuminated things, sometimes inanimate objects, sometimes people, but I sort of bring together intuitively this group of this odd cast of characters and then get them to come into some sort of communion. And to me, out of that is how plot is created, how character development is created, is that movement from into communion of this odd cast of characters. And my quintessential example of this for me, and I've always hold this in my head because it helps me remember this, is this beautiful book by Roald Dahl called Danny, Champion of the World. It's about pheasants, it's about raisins, it's about a boy who's the narrator and his beloved father and his father's iron foot. And there's this moment in the end in this chapter titled Home where they're walking down this moonlit road after bagging pheasants using raisins, and his father's waving his arms in this beautiful gesture, and you hear his iron foot like clinking against the road, and the boy is just living this moment and feeling this joy. And to me, when I heard that, I thought, what a bizarre moment that this, that he's walking down the road after doing this bizarre thing with this iron foot clinking. And I thought that is the moment that this story was moving towards. So to me, that's what you're bringing out of the ferment. And that is what these periods of inactivity are giving rise to, but it's the artistic act that kind of, creates that communion.
Amy, do you think of yourself as a collector?
Oh, definitely.
Collector of those details?
Yes, I love that. Yes, that's a great way to say it, Chai. When Chai was talking, actually, I was thinking, I thought she was going to mention this. Maybe I'm going to give you the opportunity, but when we all met as a group, there was this beautiful thing happening in her house. So when you said you're like a bird watcher, I was thinking of the crows.
Oh, those crows. Yeah. So spring semester, like I'm in a physically different, I'm actually back in my house as opposed to in a rental in Berkeley where I live half the year. In that little garage apartment, there are these like dome skylights, and I would wake up every morning with these crows that would hop on the skylights. There are these two crows that lived on the roof of this garage apartment, and and I realized that they were playing on the bubble skylights. Like they would slide down the skylights. So every morning, like first thing, I'd have these like little crow feet hopping and like sliding down the skylights. And then when I would move, into the little office room, where there's the desk, they would move over to that room. Go, there's the other bubble skylight, and they'd like eavesdrop on my Zoom calls and all this stuff, early in the morning. Yeah, right. Like those details, like even in the moments, right, of ferment or whatever those are, like there's the material, right? Lee, you talked about it, the mundane materials of life, right? Like those are amazing. Like they're amazing. There's all of this inspiration and beauty and oddness, right? Like you're saying about like the raisin and the pheasants and the iron foot, like that. Sometimes it's the juxtaposition. I mean, you can be sitting and like listening to a podcast, eating dinner late because grading has wrecked you or something, and you're like behind schedule. It could be like 9 p.m. and eating dinner, and then all of a sudden like 6 million amazing details about fish, and then it's just like it's off to the races. I love that. I love that life gives us these things and that those change all the time.
Yes, thank you. That's great. I think in some ways it maybe relates to, I'm going to start actually pulling some questions from the Q&A box here so that we can sort of continue engaging these. But there's a question from Kara, and she says, let's see, this touches a bit on an earlier question about action and reception, but she's wondering if silence is essential to the creative process. She says, I've always felt so, but as a mother of a toddler and an infant and all the noisy chaos that comes with it, this is hard to achieve. I'm learning how to create with the noisy distractions of parenthood, but I'm wondering if you have any tips or advice on how to do this. And she says she feels like this also relates to keeping a sort of daily prayer life as a parent. So I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on that. We sort of touched on a little bit of that.
Yeah, I was actually reading Kara's question as I was also simultaneously listening to what everybody, else was sharing, and it actually made me remember a conversation I also had with an older artist when I had just become a mom 5 years ago, and I stole away some time and went to my first artist talk, post motherhood, of this this older artist who was having a retrospective of her show, or of her work. And so she was not like openly saying that she was a mother, but she had like this participatory element, and it was all about like making an umbilical cord out of newsprint. And then she did mention her like grown son. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna like bypass the participatory element and just like run straight to her while everybody else is crumpling newsprint. I like want to pick her brain about how she's doing this. And to be fully honest, she did not give any like practical advice. And I since have really learned that like you can hear all of the practical advice in the world and have none of it be applicable to you. Number one, if it just doesn't match your style. But then number two, if your heart's not ready to receive it, or like a whole combination of the two. And but what she did tell me was that it was a much broader picture of trying to, again, think seasonally, and actually to identify with being an artist, not because you're making something on the daily, but really like you are an artist because you are, because you claim to be so, because you identify either with that way of thinking, or that's what's in your heart, or again, that's just like, what you've always kind of done to process things. So she was like, what you need to actually hold on to is, are you an artist or are you not? And if you are, then to recognize that that there will be seasons where you're not really getting much done. You're really just focusing on the other responsibilities in your life, according to Kara and according to me, like that thing being parenting young children. But then also there will be other seasons of your life where it's like you can super focus, and I think it does also, it relates to a lot of what all of us are already saying about how like don't force the work when unnecessary, but just to kind of try and jump on it when it comes. And sometimes that doesn't work out practically, and other times it does. Like those types of technicalities I think are a bit of a toss up, but I do often try and challenge myself with my own my own positioning towards like for example, like the silence isn't there because there's so much literal noise going on in the household. But again, oftentimes it's like, can we discipline ourselves to not hear that as just noise that's interrupting the silence? How can that noise, even though it doesn't feel like the classic artistic silence, and letting the inspiration wash over you, like it's like how else can that kind of those interruptions actually turn into artistic inspiration?
May I read a little poem segment about silence? I was pulling this up while you were talking, because silence, right? I feel like silence is so important. This is from a poem by Yusuf Kominyaка. It's a poem called Thanks, and this is one of the poems that he wrote about the Vietnam War. This particular poem, it's a gratitude poem, and it's also a prayer poem, but a part of what I love about it is it's a prayer to an unknown. Like this speaker doesn't know who or what he's thanking, but he's running through this litany of things like, thank you for letting me not die in all of these different ways. Like it talks about, all these different ways that he almost died, but didn't. So I'm gonna read this little tiny section of this poem. What made me spot the monarch writhing on a single thread tied to a farmer's gate, holding the day together like an unfingered guitar string, is beyond me. Maybe the hills grew weary and leaned a little in the heat. Again, thanks for the dud hand grenade tossed at my feet outside Chulai. I'm still falling through its silence. That poem goes on, and the ending's amazing, right? This poem, Thanks, right? I'm still falling through its silence. I feel like I'm like that line captures so much for me. There's so much in silence, right? In this case, in the poem, it's an unexploded grenade. I often conflate silence and stillness. And it's a kind of weirdness, but that's just something that I do that seems true for me in the way that my world works. I love the painter Agnes Martin's work because of a kind of quiet, actually, like a silence, a stillness, something like that. I can spend forever staring at these really big, like these massive quiet paintings, especially like the edges of her paintings, because I think that some of these are instantiations of a kind of quiet or stillness or silence that I don't know, like I don't exactly have, I don't think I have, it's funny, I'm a poet, right? And I don't have language for this. Like, that's probably why I keep writing poems. Like, how do you get at that thing, right? That really amazing gift that our lives have given us, which is this yearning for ability to recognize, to notice silence and its importance, to try to make art, to make non-silent things, right? Like to speak to what that feels like and what it means and what an incredible, weird gift it is.
I love what you said initially, where you were sort of pushing back against Berry, and what you're saying now, it strikes me as another way of pushing back. I mean, I love that Berry poem, but when he talks in the end about making something that doesn't disturb the silence, I love the poem you read because it brings about sort of, it's like a violence, talking about that violence and the risk of life and the life and death quality in silence. And actually made me think of another poem that I brought up, and I just want to share this very, very short. It's called The Whales, and it's by Kathleen Jamie. She might be a Scottish poet or maybe an Irish poet. Anyway, she says this. She says, if I could stand the pressures, if I could make myself strong, I'd dive far under the ocean, away from these merfolk. I'd discover a cave green and ventricular, and there with tremendous patience, I'd teach myself to listen, what the whalefish hear, answering through the vastnesses. I'd hear too. But oh, my love, tell me you'd swim by. Tell me you'd look out for me. Down there, it's impossible to breathe. And I just love that idea, not only of listening, of what that silence feels like, that it isn't something sort of quiet or safe, but it's an immensity, it's a vastness, it involves life and death, and there's a risk to it. And again, that last part about tell me you'd swim by, that it's so life-giving to be in a community of artists who can share these stories. So I'm just coming back to that idea. And I love Lee's advice that she keeps coming back to that idea of transforming how we even look at these moments that are not active artistic moments, or these moments that are in silence, and just that is one of like the essential things in the artistic life, is seeing what's around you as being your material. And I really do think for me that was the turning point as well, realizing that my material was not something beyond me, but was something present in my life.
Well, I also really love how Chai followed that up and said that to her, silence and stillness, like she compounds them. And I'm actually curious, like, what would happen if we actually uncompounded them and essentially like to stop using the word silence and to actually start using the word stillness. And essentially, like, I do think, like Christ goes up to the mountain to pray by himself. And there are those moments where you have to kind of step outside and kind of get a quite literal silence. But kind of you also have to kind of ask, like, how is that possible in either your daily life or just in today's contemporary world? Like, everything is moving so fast and you get so much bombardment all the time, like, how do you carve out time? I feel like that's a huge discussion that I see in a ton of different arenas. Like, how do you actually carve out time to access all of this? And I just wanted to highlight, I just really love that Chai said those two words right next to each other. And then what happens if we actually push one out and bring in the other one and start wondering, how can I get at stillness? And like, how can I make time or obtain a state of being within stillness. And then if you even turn it into stillness as a person, it's like, how can I dwell with stillness, you know?
Reframing is so powerful, right? The words we use, like David, when you were talking, I wrote down a sequence of words where you were saying, you know, you're looking at the art object, right? You're looking at it. What's the emotion? Is beauty, love, pride, awe, right? Like that felt like a reframing to me, like this really sort of magical kind of catalytic thing where it's just like, what is it? What is it, right? That being open to that possibility, that transformation, that maybe reframing of what is it that I'm experiencing here, or what is it that I'm seeking here or seeing here.
David, were you going to jump in earlier? It seemed like you were going to, so I wanted to. Okay. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think just sort of, I was thinking, you know, in the busyness of life, I think it is also important to make space for our creative practice, and you know, not let that take like a back seat. You know, I've got a really amazing artist friend who, you know, could paint like you know, any great artist alive, but he doesn't make space to produce his art. He gets bogged down in kind of the mundane things of life, you know, cleaning his kitchen, you know, going to the shops, you know, hoovering. You know, he'll much rather do these than produce a work of art, which he's more than capable of. And you know, I think it, you know, the creative life needs a certain component of discipline around it. You know, I think it's unrealistic to think that that you're going to wake up one day and produce a masterpiece. You know, there's a lot of unseen effort that goes into producing a simple piece of work. You know, it's like going from being a child doing stick figure drawings to producing a you know, a master's painting. You know, it doesn't happen by chance. And I think building in some sort of quiet time into our life, something that's structured, is something that's benefited me, you know, amazingly. You know, I think that when we take the time out to produce work, you know, I think that it compounds itself, and you know, it's only in, you know, building that structure into our lives that we can see the growth in our work. And I think that, you know, as much as you can draw on the busyness of life, you know, children playing in the background, and that's fantastic. But for me, it's, you know, it's you know, sending the children away and having the time to be alone, and having the time to just really focus on the work and focus on the creative life, is when the work is at its best, and that's when I'm at my most creative. And I think for me, putting away the distractions is really how the best work is created in my own practice.
That's great. I think that actually ties in nicely to maybe what we can sort of use as a sort of closing question. This is from Lisa, and she's sort of wondering about sort of all of your own sort of personal creative spaces, and what kind of physical surroundings sort of lead to the sort of inspiration and productivity. I think along with that, right, the sort of like mental space as well. But yeah, I guess I don't know if we want to sort of each speak to that, if you all could speak to that in the last few minutes here as a kind of, whether it's a sort of a specific thing in your space that really sort of is crucial for your own process, or a kind of like reminder that you have that you sort of look to kind of keep that sort of discipline and sort of work going. Yeah.
I can start out. I'll do, mine's very short. I recently moved from one house to another, so I haven't yet really established a new space, which has been a little bit of a problem for me. But I always imagine that I want a space that's beautiful and airy with lots of light and something beautiful to look out the window at, etc. But what I find in practice is that I need more of a den-like environment where I can sort of, I think it helps my brain sort of turn back on itself and get into that meditative space. So instead, I remember reading once, and Annie Dillard was talking about writing Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and she said that, and of course you imagine that she's always, you know, sitting in front of her creek, but what she really did is she pulled closed the window shade, right? And she actually had a picture of a tree, and she stuck that picture of the tree on the window shade. She let all her plants die, and she lived in this sort of den of solitude and silence to be able to create the mental space she needed. And so I very much relate to that. Like, I have the desire at one point for a beautiful space, and that's in my new house. I'm always like sitting in front of these big windows, and I feel like I need to have something more closed in. So.
In a creative writing workshop once, I had a professor bring in a photograph of another writer's desk and said, you know, what are your objects, and challenged all of us to think about that. I have some. One of them is always this little sculpture of, this is a little mermaid sculpture. And I was born in Sweden. My parents moved there from the US, and my grandma came to visit me when I was born, right after I was born. And it was her first time outside of the US. And whenever I look at this little sculpture, I think about that. She was a very brave person, but I think there's something kind of beautiful and brave about flying halfway across the world to see your second grandchild. Because also this involved getting on a flute plane, you know, like at that point, the little planes that land on water. So it wasn't just flying, it was like flying in this really kind of odd way to get to this small town, this small town in Sweden where my hippie parents had decamped to. I've got other objects and things around, but stuff like that matters a whole lot. They don't have to be big things, right? One's a postcard that are just always there that help me kind of connect.
There's the original of that in Copenhagen, if you want to go and see it.
Yeah, that's where it was. That's where she had to take the plane from Copenhagen to get to London. So that's why she bought that trip. So I keep that now.
For me, it's just other work. You know, there's nothing specific in my studio which I could point to as being the piece that I go back to, but it's just looking back on all the works that I've produced in the past, kind of sitting there in the studio like monuments, like markers of my history. I just look at that and kind of use that as a sort of jumping off point for going forward.
For me, it has also been kind of really specific to like the actual space and how it can fit my current life right now, which you know means that I somewhat try to hold on to a mentality that this will be temporary, because you know as one phase of life rolls into the next, you want to try and be like adaptable. And I think that comes because just the awareness that I'm a stay-at-home mom at the same time as being an artist. That is the control that is not changing. So rather than, you know, it just goes to the reframing points. Like rather than kind of being like, oh man, like I want what David has, to be able to just put away the distraction and go. But I'm not going to be able to get that as often as I want. So rather than being like stumped by that and then therefore not doing it, I have tried really hard to find a space that I am comfortable to bring my kids to as well. So like, for example, I used to have a studio in a warehouse, and I originally brought my one daughter there, but then it felt very overwhelming to bring more than one kid there. And it just started really showing itself as a space not conducive for children. So I found another space that is conducive for children. So now I kind of have the option of like, you know, when I'm blessed enough to steal away and like get that like solo time, it's a great space for that. At the same time as like almost on the daily, it's where I bring them as well, and I have like their little setup, and like they're getting old enough where they can like kind of do their own projects. I think about them as my studio mates. They're kind of doing their thing, I'm doing my thing, and it's like I can relax in the easiest or in the same kind of way that I would kind of be able to relax if it was just me in the studio. So that has been like the most crucial, really. What I fill my studio space with has not played as big of a role as like quite literally what is the space that I'm making in.
Well, thank you. We should probably come to a close because we're a little over 1:30. But thank you so much to all of you, Lee, Amy, Chai, and David. It was just such a wonderful time to be able to hear from all of you and sort of explore these questions, right, of that sort of underground spring that Flannery talked about in that quote that you shared with us, Amy. And I hope that the sort of it sort of adds to people's thinking about their own creative processes or how they engage with works of art. And so, I want to thank you on behalf of the Collegium Institute and all of our co-sponsors. You can always go to our website and sort of stay tuned with all of our upcoming events, both for our specifically arts-related events for the Ars Vivendi project, but also a variety of other events from philosophy of finance to medical humanities. We hope that you'll join us again for future events. So thank you very much. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.